Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight to the opening of the Unmaking of Art. The Unmaking of Art is a very special exhibition which is based on the following lecture by Walter Benjamin, which was given for the first time in 2011 in Guangzhou, China. Let's give a warm welcome to Walter Benjamin.
Thank you for that. Good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Eflux for hosting me, for hosting us, and thank you for that. Yeah. So tonight we are going to be turning to the rather laborious task of unmaking art, or looking at the unmaking of art. A turning away from and toward this fairly monumental task. So let's begin. So visitors to the 2011 Venice Biennale had a chance to see, among all the variety that contemporary art offers, 3 paintings by one of the old masters, Tintoretto, as part of the exhibition Illuminazione. Among the paintings exhibited at Palazzo delle Esposizioni was this, 1594 Last Supper. The painting was simply taken from the nearby San Giorgio Maggiore church and brought across the canal to Giardini, moving from a religious into a secular realm. A few years ago, the New York Times travel section published a picture of a priest in the St. Francois Xavier Church in Paris praying beneath another Last Supper, also by Tintoretto. Recently, this painting, too, was removed from the church and temporarily hung in the Napoleon Hall of the Louvre during the 2009 exhibition Titian Tintoretto Veronese. As these two events illustrate, it is not unusual today to see a certain religious artifact, a religious painting in this case, being temporarily desacralized and, after some time, reintroduced back into a church, and so regaining its sacred properties. Perhaps you've noticed that today nobody prays in front of a religious painting in a museum or gallery, not even nuns, but it is nothing unusual to see a priest praying beneath the same Last Supper while the painting is hanging in the St. Francois Xavier Church. As we all know, the original destination for this religious painting was a church, and this is why the painting was made. Its importance lies in the characters of the Christian story called the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles, and the event itself called the Last Supper. The identity of the painter, in this case Tintoretto, is incidental and irrelevant for the story. He was just a vehicle in God's service, an executor of God's will. When the same painting is exhibited in a museum, its role is completely changed. Now the main characters in the museum story, called art history, are Tintoretto the artist and the painting The Last Supper, while Jesus and the apostles are of secondary importance, somewhere in the background, almost irrelevant. Simply, they're not constitutive characters of art history. Thus, the painting itself now carries 2 different meanings. It plays 2 very different roles in 2 completely different stories. Its internal story is a religious one, the New Testament, while the external story, a meta-narrative, is secular, art history. Its original meaning was religious and later acquired secular. So, we may ask ourselves how this became possible. How did it happen that a certain object might move from one kind of a place into another, from one story into another, and completely change its meaning? To find an answer to this question, we have to go back to Rome some 500 years ago. When Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere became the Pope Julius II, he brought this statue, named Apollo, with him, and placed it in the Vatican garden named Belvedere. One day in 1506, Anno Domini, news about an excavation of an unusual statue reached the Pope, and he immediately dispatched Sangallo and Michelangelo to the site. Sangallo instantly recognized the priest Laocoon and his sons mentioned in Pliny's writings, the unfortunate characters of the mythical Troy. Not too long after, several more statues were placed in the garden, in specially built niches on the surrounding walls, including the reclining Nile and Tiber, Apollo, Laocoon, Venus, Cleopatra, and Torso. And suddenly, in the very heart of Christendom, a vision of a completely different world was beginning to emerge, a vision that would have profound impact on the entire Western world for generations to come. The sight of the collection of broken statues from the distant past, placed in the idyllic Vatican garden, later named Belvedere Romanum, marks the birth of antiquity. Also, as a novelty, being at the time a new vision of the world that was not Christian, marks the birth of modernity as well. So, for a short period of time, antiquity and modernity lived happily together in this magical garden with a beautiful view, offering a way out of the Christian universe. Those statues, previously almost invisible as scattered objects of an urban landscape, now displayed together became aesthetic objects, admired primarily for their beauty. It was almost irrelevant why they had been made in the first place, what roles they had once played, what their internal narratives were. In today's terms, we could consider these statues to be the first ready-mades, and, in fact, the first objects of art, while the Belvedere Romanum could be understood as the first museum of art, and in that brief period, even the first museum of modern art. Their immediate impact could be recognized in the contemporary masters like Raphael, Titian, and Michelangelo. Gradually, these contemporary reflections on antiquity became modernity, while antiquity itself became identified with the ancient past. Those statues now became new, non-Christian characters of a contemporary story about the distant past called ancient Rome. By being able to position oneself outside of the Christian narrative, it now became possible to recognize a crude three-piece construction that became the foundation of the secular narrative called history: Rome, Christianity, and modernity, what we call the Renaissance today. After Winckelmann's observation of the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum and his interpretation of Greek art, the mythical ancient Greece became a reality and was added to the construction before Rome, while on the other end, modernity was already in the Baroque by that time. With Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, this ancient African civilization was included into European ancestry, preceding Greece on the chronological timeline, while on the opposite end, it was already time for neoclassicism. Finally, in the 20th century, two more chapters were added. The beginning moved one step back in time, from Egypt to prehistory, while its contemporary on the other end became modernism, and art history as we know it was completed. It would begin with prehistory, followed chronologically by Egypt, Greece, Rome, Christianity, Renaissance, Baroque, neoclassicism, and ending in modernism. The story was organized along the chronological timeline, and as the methods of authentication and dating of artifacts improved, the story became more accurate, and copies were identified and separated from originals. The introduction of individual characters into the story could be traced to Vasari and his 1550 book, Lives of Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, beginning with the earliest masters, Cimabue and Giotto, and culminating with Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. By the beginning of the 19th century, the notion of an exceptional individual called an artist was being well established, and Alexander Lenoir, in his 1824 book, Comments on the Genius, the main work of the artist, could describe Michelangelo as genius, original, and individual. A painter or sculptor was not just a craftsman anymore, but a unique and exceptionally gifted individual, an almost godlike creator called an artist. And the corresponding artifact, named a work of art, became a masterpiece, also a unique and original category. But what constitutes a work of art? Is it an artifact that has defining intrinsic and unique properties that we could identify as art, or a special product made by an exceptional person called an artist? Or an object that becomes art only when it is placed within a certain sphere we call the art context? And to what degree does it have anything to do with craftsmanship? At the time of Louis XIV, painting and sculpture were part of the guild system, as they had been since medieval times. In addition to the subject matter, paintings and sculptures were mostly valued because of the craftsmanship invested in them, same as the other handmade products. It was important for a guild to keep high-quality standards, and thus they had a decisive role in giving permits for the import of paintings and sculptures from abroad, even for the king. However, initiated by the painter Lebrun, the council of the 10-year-old king issued the Arrêt du Conseil d'État on January 27, 1648, after his return from Rome. And with this decision, painting and sculpture were declared to belong to the liberal arts, and so removed from the control of the guild system. From then on, they were no longer in the category of cabinets and armor, but in the same category as astronomy, music, arithmetic, grammar. These were all non-material and individually conducted activities, not possible to be organized in the guilds, and thus couldn't have manufacturing standards. Now, painting became the result of a rather reflective activity, similar to poetry, and not something that is valued because of the mastery of the hand, so introducing the concept of a learned artist instead of an ignorant artisan. For a while, the effects of this decision were not felt, and for decades, members of the Academy diligently followed the high-quality craftsmanship standards. However, through the non-commercial beaux arts scene established around the annual salons initiated by Minister Colbert, the emphasis on the rigid quality of painting gradually loosened. But high craftsmanship standards were maintained through the 18th century, before and continuing after the Revolution. However, by the 19th century, some artists like Delacroix had pointed to the direction, which was later picked up by Impressionists like Monet, and Post-Impressionists such as Cézanne, and the road opened for Picasso, and from there, Malevich and Duchamp. It is very difficult to imagine how these works could have ever emerged from any painting or sculpture guild system. From the time of the Louis XIV's State Council decision, painting and sculpture as handcrafts were gradually transformed into an intellectual, reflective, and in a way philosophical activity that happened to be expressed non-verbally, establishing a context within which even a found object named ready-made could become art. We can also notice a certain parallel here between a urinal brought by Duchamp into an art exhibition becoming the fountain, and a broken statue of a half-naked young man brought into the Belvedere garden that became Apollo Belvedere. In both cases, a previously existing object was taken from one context and placed into another, where it acquired a new meaning, becoming an art object. Both had a previously defined purpose, why they were produced: a urinal to be installed in some public toilet, and a statue of a young man likely to be placed in some public temple or square. In addition to art history and art exhibitions, an important institution that defined what we call the art scene is the art museum. The origin of the art museum could be traced to the already mentioned Belvedere Romanum, a collection of statues brought together primarily because of their beauty and exhibited in the Vatican Garden. And as I said earlier, we could consider statues like Tiber, Nile, Torso, Cleopatra, Apollo, and Laocoon to be the first works of art. This was by no means the only collection of ancient statues at that time. But it seems that it was the most influential in directly or indirectly shaping the entire art scene. It became the core of the 18th century museum Pio Clementino, and was even briefly incorporated in the Musée Napoléon, the Louvre, in the early 19th century. It can be seen today, if you please, as a tourist attraction in the Vatican Museum. Another source of the museums were collections of curiosities that appeared in the 16th century, displaying various unusual objects, both natural and man-made, as well as collections of paintings like the Uffizi. And it was the Louvre as an art museum that brought together collections of statues and paintings into one coherent narrative open to the public after the Revolution. It also included some of the objects from the French past, removed from public places during the Revolution, but salvaged by Alexandre Lenoir, and placed in the Museum of Monuments. During the Napoleonic Wars, many of the treasures were taken from occupied European cities, including the Belvedere statues, and brought to the Louvre. The architect of this enterprise was none other than Vivant Denon, an erudite art connoisseur, who was usually among the first to enter conquered cities with a list of valuable works of art. He would find and confiscate them, pack and ship them to the Louvre, thus becoming known as the Packer. It was Denon who was appointed by the emperor to become the first superintendent of the Musée Napoléon. With all this treasure in his hands, stretching throughout centuries and civilizations now assembled in one place, perhaps for the first time ever, Denon had to consider how to display it to the public and what kind of objective rules to implement. After some thought, he decided that all works would be exhibited chronologically and by national schools. These rules became standard not only for all the museums that appeared in the 19th century, but for the structuring of the art history narrative as well. On the other hand, art museums became, in fact, art history museums. All the artifacts produced previously for some other purpose, now included in the museum's collection, acquired a new meaning and became works of art. Thus, those artifacts, like paintings by Tintoretto, brought to the museum, would have two layers of meaning, one deriving from the religious New Testament, another from the history of art. Although art history intended to be an objective story about the past, the entire past became, in a way, of course, colonized by history. Later, artifacts from other cultures were incorporated into the museums, first in the ethnographic collections and subsequently in the art museums themselves, thus becoming works of art as well. And the museums, as a materialized art history, became instruments in this colonization. That was also the moment when notions like work of art, artist, and the very notion of art were being finally shaped. From that moment on, artifacts produced within the field of the art museum were intended to play roles only in the story called art history, and as such could have only one meaning, that of works of art. In a way, we should consider only these artifacts that appeared after the art museums to be the genuine works of art. Some 50 years later, as part of the Paris 1855 Exposition Universelle, an international art exhibition was staged. This was, in fact, the first international exhibition of contemporary art, and it was organized by national pavilions. Now it was not only the past that was structured by national schools, but the present as well. The French section included special exhibits of Ingres and Delacroix, while Courbet built his own pavilion and so opted for individualism. The concept of international exhibitions organized by nationalities became standard throughout the rest of the 19th century. And finally, in 1895, it turned into a regular biennial international art exhibition known as the Biennale di Venezia. In the beginning, the entire exhibition was placed into one pavilion, later named Italia, and by 1924, it already had several separate national pavilions in addition to the main one. However, the first signs of change could be seen at the 1913 New York International Exhibition of Modern Art, known popularly as the Armory Show. In the exhibition catalog, we can see that artists were listed not by nationality, but as individuals. This was perhaps the earliest harbinger of another kind of internationalism, one that will mark the second half of the 20th century, internationalism not organized and manifested by nationality, but internationalism by individual artist. As of the mid-20th century, this was the main difference between the Venice Biennale and Documenta. When the Museum of Modern Art opened in New York in 1929, it was with a loaned exhibition of 4 post-impressionist painters, artists. For the next few years, it was a museum by name only, without a collection, located in a 5-room rented space. And on top of all that, its name was basically an oxymoron: museum and modern. For several years, it operated as a Kunsthalle, and its first concept of some permanence, proposed by its founding director Alfred Barr, became known as the torpedo in time. according to the diagram, the Museum of Modern Art would cover a 50-year time span that would travel with time. Everything that is in the collection and became older than 50 years would be transferred to the Metropolitan Museum. And in a way, this would mimic the relationship between the Musée Luxembourg and the Louvre established by the mid-19th century. However, a few years later on, the cover of the 1936 exhibition catalog, Cubism and Abstract Art, a quite different diagram was presented, as you can see here. It outlined the first 3 decades of the 20th century in modern art as a genealogical tree, organized chronologically and by international movements, clearly abandoning the notion of national schools. This represented a sort of classic retroactive historicization, which would inevitably change the meaning and interpretation of art produced previously within the field of national schools. This was the exhibition that also introduced Demoiselle d'Avignon into art history for the first time, and Barre was not hesitant to hang its reproduction at the beginning of Cubism, since the original was not available. Barre gave quite an important place to artists like Malevich and the Russian Soviet avant-garde. Those artists had already vanished from the Soviet museums thanks to a series of exhibitions, like the one in 1933 at the Tretyakov Gallery titled Exposition of Section of Capitalism, and books like The Soviet Art Museums by Fedorov and Davidov, illustrated with the installation view of the 1931 Exhibition of Bourgeois Art. And on the banner here it reads, "The Dead End of Bourgeois Art, Formalism and Self-Denial." A reproduction of Lisitsky's abstract cabinet was also in the catalog, which was being dismantled at that very moment back in the Landesmuseum in Hanover, Germany, and some of the paintings taken to the Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich in 1937. The exhibition Cubism and Abstract Art took place in New York at the time there was no modern art to be seen in all of Europe. There is some irony in the fact, as we can see on the diagram, that Alfred Barre, an American, had constructed the new modern narrative based entirely on European artifacts, in a way playing a role of an ethnographer. After this exhibition and the subsequent Dada, Surrealism, and Fantastic art, the historicization of modern art up to that point, the mid-1930s, was completed, and it became a blueprint for the future display narrative of the Museum of Modern Art, as we see it today. The story is chronological, with one end in the past closed around the 1900s, while the other end is open toward an endlessly unfolding future. The history of modern art, based on chronology and international movements, was gradually embraced in Europe after World War II. By incorporating Americans, or abstract expressionists, at the 1958 Expo in Brussels and the 1959 Documenta 2 in Kassel, it was finally shaped into the story we know today and within which we have been ever since. The story promotes internationalism and individualism, while its foundations lie in the specific nature of its characters as unique and original entities, not much different from Lenoir's definition. An artist and an artwork arranged chronologically along the timeline, ever stretching toward the future. Most importantly, this is the story that defines the very nature of art. It defines what art is. I would argue here that art is not some kind of universal category being achieved and materialized through the work of some especially gifted person called an artist, nor is it a specific human activity of all cultures from prehistory until today. Cave art, Greek art, Christian art, African art, Chinese art, Aboriginal art, American art, etc. Art is most likely a notion defined by the story called art history, and it exists only within that story. This Mondrian composition is a work of art only within art history and the art museum. Outside of that context, it's just a piece of painted canvas. An outsider could recognize it as an object which some people admire and call art. And those are people who believe in art history. Once we manage to position ourselves outside of art history, the work of art becomes an artifact of a certain cultural milieu. The story conceived by the Enlightenment, secularism, and finally shaped during Romanticism, chronology and artist's genius, is still a dominant dogma today. It was an important step. It gave an optional narrative to the Christian monopolistic position, but it was also propagated as the only true and universal story. It is time to consider a possibility that art history could be not the story, but a story. So, how to step out of art history is, of course, not an easy question. And I don't think it's possible to have a clear answer today. I'm sorry. On the other hand, we have seen that there was a precedent initiated some 500 years ago at the Belvedere Garden when the exit out of the Christian story opened with the invention of antiquity and modernity, enabling the historical narrative to be established. This new narrative became possible with the new constitutive notions, chronology, uniqueness of artist and artwork, completely different from the Christian story based on God, Son of God, Holy Spirit, saints, miracles, etc., without a chronological sequencing of events. On the other hand, the historical narrative didn't forget the Christian story, but by positioning itself outside, it just recontextualized it. If the constitutive notions of art history are chronology and originality and uniqueness of its characters, a meta-narrative could not have chronology, originality, and uniqueness of its characters as its constitutive notions. So, let's start with originality. What is an original painting? It seems it's not easy to give a good answer to such a simple question. Is it a painting with some properties, characteristics not seen on any painting previously painted? Or is it an authentic painting painted by a hand of a certain painter? Or something else? Perhaps we'll have more luck with a copy. A copy would be a painting that repeats the formal properties of another painting called the original. While the original is admired and valued, a copy is considered to be trivial and worthless, since it just repeats the properties of the original. And art history is based on originals. But what's a copy? What's a painting of a painting? If this is not a pipe, then a copy of a painting is not what is depicted on it. We won't even consider what might be the meaning of a copy of a painting of a pipe with the inscription, "This is not a pipe," since we might come to the conclusion that this is not even a painting. Sounds absurd, but why not? Does every painted surface have to be a painting? For the time being, we'll stick with the simple compositions of Mondrian. These are not one, but two copies. Observe. And we don't know if they're painted by the same painter or at the same time. They're signed with Mondrian's initials and carry different dates. You may not be able to see it from here, but bottom left. One's dated 83, the other's dated 91. Both years long after Mondrian's death. The first time I encountered these paintings was in 1986, when I was invited by the Marxist Center in Ljubljana to give a lecture on these copies of Mondrian, carrying his initials but with the unusual dating, to say the least. Not only were they all dated after Mondrian's death, but some carried years that were yet to come. 91, 93, 96. The lecture, titled Mondrian, 63 to 96, was announced by the local press. As I remember, back then I announced three aspects of these copies. I already mentioned one relates to semantics. While both the original and copy are formally identical, this is not the case on the level of meaning. Mondrian's original is, as we all know, an abstract painting. But is its copy one too? It is, if we know what an abstract painting is. And if we don't know, this is a copy. But if we do know all this, then as a copy, it becomes a faithful depiction of another object that happened to be an abstract painting. Thus, a copy of an abstract painting is a realistic or representational painting. Furthermore, unlike the original, which stands for itself and could not be repeated and remains the original, a copy stands for something else. It represents the original. It becomes a certain symbol that could be repeated many times without necessarily changing the meaning. While the original can play only one role at a time, its copies can play different roles in different stories simultaneously. Then there's the notion of the identity and uniqueness of the author. Although in this particular case, the paintings are signed with Mondrian's initials, only by the dating is it clear that they're not originals. An original as a unique entity implies another unique entity, and that's the author. When there's no original, when we have a copy instead, there's no place for the author. That's another consequence of a copy. Finally, there are questions of chronology, art history, and museum. In my lecture 25-ish years ago, I described an imaginary walk through the museum in which both the original and the copy are hung. Bless you. While walking through the museum, following the chronological timeline, we first encounter an original Mondrian dated 1929, and then several decades later, its copy hanging in the mid-1980s. Clearly, this could be described as a short-circuiting of art history, a sort of déjà vu, in opposition to the idea of evolution and progress. And this is when we trust or have determined the date of production. But in the case of these paintings, we can rely neither on dates nor on the identity of the painters, hence rendering them illegible to be placed within art history or the museum. The only way to place them in the museum would be perhaps to establish a special zone separated by a line from the rest of the museum exhibitions. There could be a warning posted. We do not guarantee anything beyond this line. Simply, these paintings would be outside of art history. What will become of them? What role will they play? And in which stories? It's hard. They surely play a role in the lecture back then, just as they're playing today. Another case that I know of when the International Exhibition of Modern Art. This exhibition, dated 2013, was last shown within the larger exhibition, What is Modern Art?, in Berlin, 2006. However, the earliest version of this exhibition was presented for the first time not in 1993, as it says on this announcement, but in 1986, and not in New York, but in Belgrade. In addition to these inaccuracies in the catalog, the works themselves are dated in reverse chronology from the one we know. Therefore, a painted definition of the painting by Kossuth is dated 1905. The perspective correction by Dibitz, 1907, followed by Lichtenstein's 1911, John's 1930, Magritte 1969, Duchamp's fountain, this time not as a ready-made, but a plaster dated 1971, and the nude 1973, a Mondrian 1983, another 1992, two Malevich supremacist paintings from 1985, and finally Picasso was dated in the future, 1995, even beyond the year of the catalog. Itself was organized chronologically, with Kossuth, André, and Dibitz placed at the beginning of the 20th century. Two Lichtensteins from 1911, a wall of mostly abstract art, except for John's, and toward the end of the century are Picabia, Brancusi, Picasso, and Matisse. The exhibition ends with a series of works by Mondrian, Malevich, and Duchamp, including French Window, dated 2019, still in the future. One can sense there's no notion important to art and art history that was not turned upside down here. From originality of an artwork and the identity of the author to the meaning, chronology, and causality. One interesting footnote. I recently found two postcards addressed to Man Ray, who was one of the organizers and the photographer of the show. He was sent these postcards by two of its participants. Jan Dibitz sent a Man Ray photo of Duchamp with this message. Dear Man Ray, how are you doing? I hope your international show of big shots was very successful. Tell Matisse I like his new work. Was very nice to meet Duchamp last week. Mondrian sent his regards. Thanks for the mail. Carl Andre sent back an exhibition postcard picturing the nude descending the staircase with a comment. Thank you for sending the catalog of your futuristic exhibition. The first photograph, Kossuth André Dibitz, shows a fine, white, square floor sculpture. What is the rubbish piled on top of it? The future is prelude. He was apparently referring to the sculpture in this photo. Ever since I found the photographs, I've been wondering, these Jan Dibitz and Carl Andre, are they for real? Or Man Ray, or Walter Benjamin for that matter? If, as Carl Andre thinks, the future is prelude, then perhaps a part of that future is the Museum of American Art, represented here at Arnolfini with the collection 50 Years of American Art. Its beginnings are buried in time, but according to some eyewitness accounts, it quietly opened back in the early 1900s in the ground floor space on Stahlenallee 91 in Berlin and existed throughout the 20th century without ever being noticed. In one of its galleries today, visitors can still see the Museum of Modern Art, based on Alfred Barr's 1936 diagram consisting entirely of European modern art. While on the walls, there are paintings of exhibition catalogs of the post-war American art shown in Europe. Another gallery, named after Dorothy Miller, is decorated with paintings from the 1959 catalog, The New American Painting. Although it is called a museum, in my view, this is a museum in name only. It would be more accurate to say it's a meta-museum, a museum about another museum, in this case, the Museum of Modern Art. In addition to its permanent exhibits, this meta-museum holds several collections, one of which, titled Sites of Modernity, is currently on view at the Van Abbe's Museum. Here, the collection of Belvedere Romanum is juxtaposed with the Museum of Modern Art. Once these two museums had been museums of modernity. Today, they both became museums of antiquity. Furthermore, it's now clear to me that the entire art domain is a thing of the past and will continue to exist only by inertia, the way religion continued to exist after the Enlightenment. Being an artist today is like being a priest at the time of the emergence of natural philosophers. It's an obsolete category. In order to make sense of the emerging world, art museums will have to change too. A few of them will most likely continue to exist. Not as living places, but rather as some kind of time capsules, where people who are outside of the art narrative would go to see what once was art and the art museum, the way a secular person goes to see a Gothic cathedral. Most of the art museums will transform into museums about art, where former artwork will acquire a new status, one of a specimen potentially equal in its value and importance to any other art artifact, copies, objects, books, documents, etc. The fundamental change will happen to those artifacts conceived primarily as works of art. Some of the original artworks will acquire a new meaning and so continue to play a role in the future, but not as artworks. On the other hand, they'll continue to be admired as such by those who are still within art history, who are still believers in art. In a way, a Christian painting is still worshipped in a church as a sacred object by the people who believe in the New Testament. Furthermore, completely new places will emerge, dedicated to remembering art and certain episodes from the past, including art history and the making of art history, without necessarily exhibiting any works of art. One such place is the Museum of American Art, where principal exhibits are paintings, but paintings that are not works of art. While in the case of the ready-made, a non-art object is transformed into art by changing its context. In the Museum of American Art, we have traditional art objects like paintings transformed into non-art paintings, into non-art artifacts. As I mentioned earlier, art as a category that came out of the Enlightenment and was finally shaped during Romanticism, the artist, creator, and art history as a chronologically based story about the past. Both these are becoming a story of the past, art and chronological art history. The departure beyond the art domain will likely take some time, as all things do, until the new categories, new concepts are established in new stories about the past, invented, reinvented, stories that will offer different visions of the future. But not all the stories will take us to the same place. A story like art history brought us here. And from now on, it would be wise to understand the choices we make and the consequences of the stories we decide to follow. Who knows? Perhaps the future will always remain a prelude. Ich danke Ihnen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.